Good afternoon to you all, and thank you so much for joining us for today's Achates live session on Thursday, the 12th of May. Today, we're going to be delving into the topic of trusts, foundations, and grant making, and specifically the key considerations in a changing landscape. Our discussion today is going to be chaired by our director, Caroline McCormick, who I shall hand over to in just a short while. My name is Deborah Larwood. I am Director of Development here at Achates. We're a creative consultancy with a holistic approach to recruitment, fundraising, and strategy development. We take our name from Greek and Roman mythology. Achates was a close and loyal friend and advisor to Aeneas. So we think our name quite neatly describes the relationship that we offer to our clients within the cultural sector. We set up Achates Live to support the sector, to bring together fundraisers and other arts professionals in order to discuss and drill down into the key topics, and also to enable you to help and support one another along the way. Now, whilst we acknowledge that Achates doesn't necessarily have all the answers, what we absolutely do have is an overview of the cultural sector, and we're incredibly passionate about using this perspective and role in the most supportive way. These live streams began as a way for us to support the sector during the first lockdown, and they've gone on to continue on a very regular basis since then, always driven by the topics that you, our viewers, have requested. Now, today's session, as I mentioned, will be focused on the key considerations of trusts and foundations and grant making, where we'll be exploring the complex and changing world of trust and foundation fundraising, from shedding light on some of the ethical, legal and financial rigor in grant making, through to discussing strategic approaches and making your applications as robust as possible. And finally, just to say that all of the information that is shared in today's conversation is, of course, live and correct at the time of broadcast. Now, I am delighted to be able to welcome our special guests who will be exploring this topic with us today. And I'm particularly pleased because I've had the great privilege of working alongside each one of them during the course of my own career. So without further ado, our wonderful panel today includes Bhavisha Kakedia Moran. Bhavisha is the grant manager at Freelance Foundation, focusing on the creation and implementation of funds to visual arts organisations in the UK. She's also vice chair of E Street Arts, based in Leeds, and has specialisms in trust fundraising and organisational development. Bhavisha has worked across regional and national organisations, including South Bank Centre and Opera North. Her professional passion for creating the environment for high impact projects and meaningful evaluations, policy writing, and championing those from any walk of life to find inspiration and joy within the arts. Good afternoon, Bhavisha. It's great to have you with us.
Good afternoon, Deborah. Good afternoon, everybody.
Lovely. Next up on our panel is Katya Evans. Katya is currently head of trusts at Rambert, responsible for devising and delivering this trust strategy to meet revenue targets, supporting artistic, community, organisational aims and programmes. Katya is an experienced revenue and capital fundraiser across many art forms: theatre, dance, museums, literature. And her previous roles include Development Associate at Brighton Dome and Festival, Head of Development at Hofesh Schechter Company, and Deputy Director of Development at the Almeida. Katya has specialised in trust funding for the past several years. A very warm welcome to you, Katya.
Thanks so much, Deborah, and hi to everyone.
And finally, on our panel today is Rose Goddard. Rose leads the trust fundraising work here at Achates as our head of trusts. Rose worked really closely and collaboratively with a wide range of clients, representing a variety of art forms and supporting organisations to build their successful trust strategies, which are rooted in an audience-informed approach for both capital and revenue funding campaigns. Rose has extensive experience of working with strategic funders such as Arts Council England, as well as Paul Hamlin, Esme Fairburn, and also specialises in prospect research and bid writing and project development. Good afternoon, Rose, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Deborah. Hi, everyone, and lovely to be here.
And as I mentioned, today's session will be chaired by our fabulous director, Caroline McCormick, who will shortly set the scene for us and then lead today's discussion with our panel. I will come back to join you at the end with some questions from the audience. So please do send those over in the chat as the conversation goes along, and our General Manager, Victoria, will ensure that those can be picked up and covered off. So that's it from me for now, and I'll hand over to you, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Deborah, for that really lovely introduction. And yes, we're lucky to have such a fantastic panel today. I'm really looking forward to our session. So let me set the scene a little bit. As we all know, income from trusts and foundations makes up 38% of the 545 million for culture from voluntary income sources in England. So it's around 207 million in the last private investment in culture survey, which was 2019. As you all know, we're just waiting for that new data now, and hopefully you've all contributed to it. Of course, voluntary income isn't distributed equally across the country. We all know this. And income from trusts is particularly important outside of the 50 biggest brands, who raise 60% of all of that money. So for organisations outside of that group of 50 big names, trusts represent nearly half, at 48% of their fundraised income. And whilst not all of those 50 organisations are in London, the majority are. And these organisations are more dependent on major individual donors, with 52% of their voluntary income coming from that source. Nonetheless, trusts still play a hugely important role, representing a third of their voluntary income, which of course tends to be larger in scale. Now, we all know that trusts have taken huge strides in recent years trying to address some of these geographical and scale disparities. But one of the things I try to also remind our clients of is that trusts themselves are very nimble organisations, punching far above their weight in terms of the impact they enable and the staff and resources that they themselves have. They may be giving away substantial amounts of money, but their own resources are themselves very lean. So it's unrealistic to think that trusts will know every organisation or have the capacity to attend all the events they're invited to. So when you're thinking about a relationship-based approach, as of course we always advise, these are factors that you have to bear in mind. Now, as we've talked about on Achates Live a number of times now, there's also been a significant shift away from rhetorical bids into theory of change-based approaches. And in fact, of course, theory of change itself actually came from the Kellogg Foundation in the US in the 1990s, which is a great example of how the funders can really affect our approach and our thinking about our own practice. And of course, we've also seen funders like Hamlin take a really pioneering approach to issues such as diversity and inclusion that put them perhaps more in dialogue with the approaches of some US funders. They've also notably started to declare how many grants they're making through specific funds to get a greater perspective on success rates. I think we've all been quite shocked, taken aback to see actually that certain funds may only give 45 grants. And so suddenly realizing that there are 831 MPOs alone helps to give you a sense of scale and why success rates may be challenging. So what are the other issues and trends funders are looking at and that we should be considering? Well, as Deborah says, we're very fortunate to have three really expert panelists with us today who are going to share their insight and knowledge from both sides of the table, grant maker, fundraiser, and the third side of the table for you, Rose, as consultant, to really look at these trends in grant making they're seeing and approaches that they're bringing to these issues. So if I may, I'd like to come to you, Bhavisha, in the first instance, and perhaps tell us a little bit about things from your perspective, which is so interesting because, of course, you've moved from fundraiser to grant maker now. Looking forward to hearing more.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. It's funny that introduction really covers quite a bit of the work that Freelance Foundation have been doing in the last year. So to give a little bit of context, Freelance Foundation are a private family-owned foundation. We're based in London, established in 2015, so relatively new as a grant maker, and our funds are specifically aimed towards arts education, the visual arts, and our organisation kind of has three strands, one which is grant making, one which is research. We publish the research into female artists every year with Dr. Kate McMillan, and we also have our own arts education wing of our organisation. And those three elements really play into how we create our strategy as an organisation. And in terms of changing landscapes, the foundation took action back in 2019, just before the pandemic, after the death of George Floyd, to really dedicate £3 million of grants directly to diversity, equity and inclusion. And my work with the foundation is focused on the third round of those grants, which are specifically targeted towards smaller grassroots organisations that are Black and Brown led, and for Black and Brown artists and practitioners. So in terms of how we approached working with a specific group of organisations, how we're directing our impact as a foundation towards tackling racial inequality in the visual arts is firstly, by referencing the sector, we took time to really read the research that was out there and to listen to what organisations actually feel that they need, what would be successful. And I would encourage anybody in a development team to really always have that one eye on the sector. So one of the key reports that informed the way that we have structured our Space to Dream Fund is the BOAB Foundation's report, which is called Digging Deeper. And it's full of amazing insights that are tailored towards actually interrogating all of those funds that were set up in 2019, 2020, that are tackling racial inequality or, more socially focused issues, whether they're in the arts and culture sector or outside of that, and around social and racial justice, and really digging down into what these foundations, what organisations actually need to see from funders. So we've taken some of that research, we've done our own research, and as you mentioned, Caroline, having been a fundraiser and attended all of the conferences, all of the networking, and often the same conversations are happening in all of those spaces about that experience as a fundraiser. And it was really an opportunity to bring that into the way that we work as a foundation and really consider the fact that fundraisers, whether they are professional development staff within an organisation or volunteers in small organisations, staff where fundraising sits across many of their functions, as the first port of call, they are our very first audience, they are our key stakeholders, and we really need to ensure that our grant making speaks to them as much as it speaks to the organisation that they represent. So one of the key things I'm really pleased that we've been able to do with our Space to Dream Fund is work specifically with a diversity action group of really experienced, skilled artists and creatives in the sector. So, for example, we have Melanie Keane, who's director of the Welcome Collection. We have John Oconfor as an artist, being able to be part of that decision making and to influence what we're doing. And we're taking lived experience and we're taking all of that wider sector experience into consideration with each step that we make. And one of the things that came through, and thankfully I've had some great feedback this week from the organisations that are currently within that process, that we've taken the steps to support grantees in a way that isn't arduous. So we fully understand how much time, resource, effort, energy it takes a full organisation to apply for a significant amount of money. And one of the key things that we've done is to almost acknowledge and not in a way reward, but we've given application grants of £600 for all those that were taken through to a full application. So in context, we had an expression of interest phase, which we opened out to all organisations within the UK that fit our eligibility criteria, and we were specifically focusing on those who don't always get the funding. So the likelihood is that they are very small NPOs or not on the national portfolio, organisations that are more grassroots who might not have established development teams, etc. And we've supported them not only with that application grant, but also we've hosted webinars. Theory of change has actually been the crux to the application process for the Space to Dream Fund, because our approach is that we're looking at what is effective for that organisation rather than comparing projects from different organisations. Our way of recognising the value of the work is how important it is to that particular organisation, their stakeholders, their audiences, the areas that they know the best. We are, as a foundation, not experts on everything that is going on around the country, and we don't expect every project that comes to us to be unique, shiny, better than all the rest. We really just want to understand why it's important that each organisation does the work that they do in the way that they see best. So theory of change has been fantastic for encouraging organisations to think beyond the immediate projects and look at their medium and longer term context for themselves. So hopefully we're going to see some really exciting projects in context. And hopefully the act of creating a theory of change is then useful to the organisation, because of course, as you mentioned, Caroline, we can't fund everybody, and the success rates are what they are because the need is so high. But we've really approached our process this time to say we hope that organisations, having been through the process with us, are then left with a valuable suite of policies, programmes, plans that they can then use for their own organisational development. And one of the key things there, speaking about where we touched on the legal element, is equality impact assessments. As a foundation, we really pride ourselves on the due diligence that we do, and also ensuring that our organisations are working to best practice. And because we're working in the theme of racial inequality in the visual arts, we're really closely ensuring that we are compliant with the Equality Act 2010, and the organisations that we're working with, although of course their programmes are what we would say common sense. If there's a lack in one area, then you would fill those gaps. You would want to increase engagement, increase opportunities for Black and brown artists. And what we're doing is working through the legal framework with those organisations to ensure that everything that they do and that they create is supported by the legislation, supported legally, supported with reference and research, and is, really pushing that social justice agenda in the right ways, really, without reproach, and also to ensure that we're having the most effective projects take place within this country. I think that's pretty much everything. We could definitely go down the route talking about due diligence if that's useful to anybody, but in terms of that grantee support, we host webinars with potential applicants. We coach them through their application process with us, and it's something quite special about offering that bespoke one-to-one that we're able to do. And unfortunately that does mean that we are unable to do that at a large scale, but hopefully we're making small ripples in the sector that can kind of work their way out, and this time with the Space of Dream Fund we're starting at that very grassroots level.
Well, Bavisha, I don't know about your fellow panelists, but I certainly feel really inspired by what you've just said. Thank you so much. It's so exciting to hear about an organisation that is talking about rewarding good work, not just things that are unique or new, which I have to say, I think at Achates, we constantly sort of delete the word unique from applications because we know it. Generally, they're not. They're building on good work in the sector. Secondly, an organisation that is leading by example. I think that at a time when we're seeing application processes have this real deep rigour within them, which I think we welcome, we also want to make sure that they're relevant and appropriate and inclusive. And I think to hear that you're making sure that organisations are getting something out of that process, I think, again, that's something we really, really echo here, that we just completely think that the theory of change might start with the fundraising need, but certainly shouldn't end there. And then finally, your point about due diligence and the idea of sustained change. I think at Achates, we're completely committed to sector transformation from a social justice perspective, but we want it to be a sustained process, not simply a process of pushing people forward because of their context. And that sounds really inspiring in terms of the work that you're doing. So I know you're going to get a lot of questions in a bit, but thank you. That's really brilliant. Katja, it's brilliant to have you with us this morning. You've got such, this afternoon, you've got such extensive experience as a fundraiser across a range of organisations. So really, really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about being on the other side of the table as a fundraiser and how you're approaching and adapting your work to really reflect some of the trends that are going on.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Caroline and Bavisha. Yeah, that was really inspiring, and yeah, it was great to hear about the Freelance Foundation. And yeah, I was going to talk just very briefly about, I suppose, some of the trends three in particular that I've noticed just over the past couple of years, and then follow a little about sort of working internally with colleagues on these all of these external factors. The first, Bavisha, you've already sort of talked brilliantly about this trend that your organisation is responding to, and that's the move towards equality, diversity and inclusion. I feel, previously, and when maybe I first started in fundraising, there was a focus from trusts on participant reach, how many people you were reaching, as opposed to the demographics of who you were reaching. Sort of since 2020, when the systemic inequalities across society have really been highlighted, arts organisations and trusts and foundations rightly began to re-examine their priorities. Again, as Bavisha was saying, they very much did strategic developments from organisations like Esme Fairbairn Foundation, making a commitment to being an equitable fund. And I've noticed it's also filtered into questions on application forms, specifically about diversity, such as Full Foundation. More recently, it feels that there's been a broadening of this trend, with trusts not only focusing on ethnicity, but also on socio-economic backgrounds of people that are underserved in the arts. And it's so important, I think, that we move with these trends and move as swiftly as I think some trusts are trying to do. The second is really the impact of COVID. Trusts, it was interesting, Caroline, you talked about trusts having to be nimble, and I think they certainly were during the crisis, and opened up whole new funds, increased their funding, many of them. It also meant more, I think, dialogue and flexibility with organisations. Long-standing supporters of Rambert were willing to support core and unrestricted activity where they never had before. It had always been very specific projects they previously funded. So it seems to have led to an increase in understanding and transparency about what organisations really need. And it'll be interesting to see, after the period of grace I think we're still in, actually, if this flexibility really continues. The third is around, again, environmental sustainability, where trusts, as we are, having to respond to the climate crisis. And although, of course, environmental sustainability has been a key strand for major funders, John Ellerman, Esme Fairbairn, etc., they've never been part of the arts criteria, I don't think, until now. As with EDI aims, I think funders are increasingly interested in hearing how we're responding to these challenges organisationally. They're setting out their key principles in these areas. For example, Garfield Weston Foundation have an environmental statement on their website, and they expect us to do the same. I've just applied to a brand new fund by a European foundation, Fedora, who support opera and ballet, to support Rambert to create a sustainable dance network. So these are arts funders, but they're understanding we need support in this area too. So so all of these new trends, obviously present brilliant opportunities, but also challenges. And as trust funders, we're sort of acting as a middle person in many ways, sort of translating the trust and foundations criteria for our organisation and vice versa. So just a few things very briefly about working internally with colleagues on the application process. I think the artistic project or organisational strategy may be developed as an idea, but it can take often the process of applying to a trust or a public fund such as Arts Council to really pin down the outcomes, the evaluation framework, etc. This is a really useful exercise for everyone across the organisation. So do involve all the departments you need support from to bring the application together. It can take time, a structure of deadlines from you to make sure all of the bases are covered, but it's really worth it. And I think other departments and your colleagues will see the worth in that when that work's done. I think keeping alert to the trends in the landscape, what other arts organisations are doing, what the Arts Council are doing, because obviously that all filters through. networking with other arts fundraisers, and signing up to sessions with trusts and foundations. I recently went to a session around with Paul Hamlin Foundation, Esme Fairbairn, the National Lottery, and I Will Fund, who were sharing learnings on the Act for Change Fund. So Ronbear weren't supported, but it was incredibly useful to understand where they were coming from, and that's a resource, I think. And in turn, sharing these findings with key colleagues within your organisation. Things move so quickly, thinking about these trends, COVID, for example. So setting regular meetings with key senior management colleagues outside of specific applications has been really important. In turn, asking them to share information on organisational strategy, like new business models in response to COVID. I think working in an organisation that really is actively making changes in terms of EDI and sustainability has meant I can demonstrate we're committed to the same principles as some of these trusts. But if your organisation isn't ahead of the curve or leading the way on these trends, I think it's so important to let the people who can shape delivery, the executive team, senior management team, let them know what these trends are and really advocate internally for that, because it's so important. And I think increasingly important to these funders. It helps often leading from the trust and foundation criteria, I think, often to interrogate and develop your projects with the colleagues who have to deliver it, whether that's a participation manager or the CEO. It really helps to ensure the project is the right fit, and you can respond to any concerns or gaps in delivery that you can see at kind of the early application stage. And I think once you've interrogated their criteria, you've found the sweet spots where there's an overlap in the principles and objectives, your organisation's vision and aims can really lead the way. And that's...
Great. Thank you so much, Katya. There's such a lot there. And I have to say, I'm so grateful for your really thoughtful approach. So many really great ideas in there that are so considered. If I may pick up on a few of them, I love your point about wider intersectionality. I think that we've all really welcomed the fact that the Arts Council has included socioeconomic context within its definitions of diversity in the MPO process. And I think we all want to just see this much richer, more nuanced view of our society and our culture. And it's great to see that starting to come through, absolutely. I'm really also interested in that point about the values-based approach and really how you can be a driver for that within your organisation, whether that be in terms of a diversity inclusion agenda or it be from the environmental perspective. And I'm really proud to see our sector starting to really pull those values to its fore. For me, it's always been critical that not only do we do good work, but we do it in a way that we can be proud of. So it's great to see that change coming. A point we might want to come back to, we'll leave it to our guests today, our audience, but I'm really interested in this conversation about from reach to depth, because it's something we've certainly talked about a lot. And then I start to wonder now if there's another loop round as we look at the role of things like CPPs and we start to think about perhaps those focus on priority places. And certainly a lot of those initiatives that are coming through are back to the idea of volume. So I think there's this really interesting dialogue that's happening, because without doubt, you're quite right, depth has been the focus, but is there a volume argument coming back into the play? And then just two more things I want to say. The first is, yes, writing your project on the page. And for Achates, it's something we're really familiar with in terms of the great role that the fundraiser can play in helping the organisation move from that perhaps more direct sort of process into one where fundraising is playing a central role in the organisation and helping inform the strategy. And I think it's one of the things that we all as fundraisers really enjoy, is that central role. I'm keen in the future to have a couple of sessions, one on perhaps how to get creatives to create projects through a theory of change, because they're always going to start with ideas, and secondly, how they liaise with audiences without feeling overpowered by perhaps what the audiences have to say, but there for a future time. But lastly, you had another great piece of advice, which was very similar to one of Bhavisha's, which was do your homework. And I think that's always a really wise lesson. So thank you, really brilliant insights there and much appreciated. Rose, last but not least, over to you, my dear.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and Deborah as well. Hello, my name is Rose. I'm Head of Trusts here at Achates, and I'm really pleased to be joining you today to share some of my experiences in what has proved to be really, since I joined Achates at the beginning of last year, a really fascinating and surprisingly kind of fast evolving funding landscape. I think sometimes we might think of trusts as the big sort of slow moving beasts of the funding ecosystem. But as Caroline said, they too are lean organisations often themselves, and in the wake of kind of huge and intersectional global shifts that we've seen over the past couple of years, not least the pandemic, worsening social structural inequality, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the growing climate crisis, trusts have, of course, like all of us, had to adapt and re-envision their place in a new world. And it's been really great to hear from Bavisha and Katya too about how they've seen this playing out. I've really seen it while working on bids with clients to strategic trust funders, as well, of course, as Arts Council England, many of whom launched new strategies and rounds of support during the pandemic. So these included Paul Hamlin's 20 million emergency fund in April 2020, the £30 million Garfield Weston Culture Fund in February of last year. And as Katja spoke about, we've also seen new strategies from Paul Hamlin and Esme Fairburn in the past 18 months that confirmed a renewed commitment from them to investing in racial and social justice, creative communities, and the natural world. So just looking at what these new strategies emerged out of so that we can kind of see how much things have changed. Paul Hamlin's Funding for Arts and Culture report sets a really helpful context here. As Caroline said, we are waiting for the next ACE Private Investment in Culture report. So this one is quite a good and detailed interim in the meantime. It was commissioned by the Arts Funders Group and published in April of last year. And it reviewed data from 19 key trusts and foundations across 2019 and 20. So kind of the last typical year where audited information was available. And it tells us that those trusts contribute around £88 million a year to arts and culture. So a really key part of the UK's funding ecology, as we know. And in that year, the 4 highest spending trusts were responsible for 75% of the total grant expenditure. And no surprises that they were Esme Fairburn, Garfield Weston, Paul Hamlin, and the Wolfson Foundations. So what are they looking for from arts organisations? Well, these large investors tend to prioritise things, I would say, like engagement and learning work, projects that look to widen audiences, and work that champions the value of arts and culture to society, while some also favour organisational development and supporting the cultural workforce and helping it to become more diverse too. So while all of this remains true, I'd also add, since the report, that funders large and small now increasingly want to see a clear sense of partnerships, often across sectors, multi-agency approaches even to help reach audiences, and a sense of onward journey in your organisation too. So I'd always advise clients not just to talk about what you're already doing, but to tell funders in a rigorous and structured way, ideally informed by a theory of change, how your work is going to transform to bring about change through collaborative working, and really crucially reach the hardest to reach, as Katja says, and as we've said, not just in numbers, but by understanding who they are and their priorities. So can you talk about using arts as a methodology for social change, for example? And as we've spoken about, how are you working hard not just to think or talk about diversity, equity and inclusion, but be a force for progress here? I've spoken about large funders, but I also just want to mention the smaller grant makers too, who make up such a crucial piece of the puzzle. And they're often pioneering when it comes to supporting talent development, hyperlocal activity and new work, for example. They don't always have the long-term spending power and the scale of portfolios that the larger trusts have, but nonetheless, they contribute a huge amount to the richness of the trust and foundation landscape in the UK. So do consider them in your planning. And the report I mentioned earlier indicates that the organisations that tend to have the most success with trusts and foundations are also those who are drawing from other sources of funding too, suggesting something that I'd really emphasise as well, which is that a diverse income base is increasingly essential for success with trusts, so statutory, earned income and corporates. And size is a factor here too, of course. I think larger organisations will often have a wider mix of income streams, which partly reflects their ability, of course, to put resource into generating this. But no matter your size, in a post-COVID world especially, I think trusts really want to see how you're prioritising a range of funding streams to create a dynamic income base. A funder like the Foyle Foundation particularly prioritised this focus on resilience, and we know that they are actively repositioning their support to move away from core funding for NPOs, for example, in order to support a broader range of organisations. And just a point on geography as well as size, kind of finally, really, the pulling power of London was really clear before the pandemic, and it does remain. The capital received more than a third of the grants from trusts and foundations in that report in 2019. But we've seen this changing slowly, and it's certainly reflected and influenced by ACE's Let's Create strategy and its focus on support outside of London, but also through things like Esme Fairbairn and Paul Hamlin's renewed focus on work that's rooted in communities around the UK. And a really important trend we at Achates have observed of late is the larger funders really increasingly wanting to see organisations already embedded in the communities that they're proposing to support. So it's no longer enough to be saying you'll work with a group or groups whose needs or priorities you don't yet know, but are going to, try and find out about. And instead, funders really want to see you engaging in co-creation, community consultation from the outset to then drive that long-term engagement and, crucially, to share power. So I know we're going to come on to talk about how vital it is to put your audiences front and centre, not just in your applications, but your wider organisational strategy. And of course, we'd always counsel that what's reflected in your strategy and then in your funding bid should hopefully never be very far apart. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. That's super. I was thinking there wasn't a lot left to say, and yet you've come up with a number of new points. So thank you. It's always hard to be the last on these really brilliant panels. Love your point about partnership. I think what's clear is that Arts Council is really wanting to see organisations embedded in their communities and have that breadth of partnerships. And I think that's something we're seeing across the breadth of not only the statutory, but also the trust side of things now. I think that's such a good point. And I love your point about the onward journey. I think it's so good. And it's something that is so clear to me, certainly with the Achates Philanthropy Prize, more on that soon, folks. We always saw that the challenge when we were giving people feedback that on their nominations, what they faced was that they told us about what they'd done, but they hadn't told us where it was taking them. I think it's something we're really aware of. And it's a really great point. How is this part of a journey, not just the destination in itself? Love that point about drawing on a diverse income base. I mean, we always talk about that a lot in Achates, particularly with capital funders, don't we? And saying they want you to want to check that you've looked at every opportunity. They don't want you just to rely on them. But I think you're right. In a competitive climate, that's even important on the revenue side of things. And then I think that last point about communities and really being embedded within them already is a really critical one. I think we've observed that in the team, haven't we? Just in the last 6 months, we've seen certain funders just not being interested if you haven't already made the groundwork. Absolutely. And I think that's really where I'd love to begin on my questions, if I may, and perhaps I can start with you and then come back to you, Bhavisha, and to you, Katja, is not only already embedded in your community, but I think we're seeing a number of funders already saying that unless your project has already had at least a pilot phase, they won't support you. Now, that's really challenging for the small to medium size, and that's a message we're getting from the bigger funders. And I just wondered if you'd got any thoughts on reflections on that, about does that basically keep the small to medium size organisations always to being small to medium size because they can't make the leap to the bigger funders? Rose, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I think something we have certainly seen organisations struggle with. I would say, yeah, often that pilot phase is really key. And what I would suggest is, can you think about perhaps smaller regional funders that you can perhaps look to build relationships with to help facilitate a pilot phase in that area. And crucially, again, I would go back to partnerships. Partners in these areas are your local experts, and not just arts partners, but increasingly, people across the social sectors, voluntary organisations too. So yeah, it really is that sort of multi-agency approach that we've talked about, and just unlocking a smaller amount of funding so that you can run a pilot period to then go on and build up towards something bigger.
And Pavisha, from your side, it's clearly something you've been thinking about a great deal, because you have been doing this very careful work with organisations to help them make that change. Is that an issue you've been particularly conscious of in doing that?
Not particularly in the sense of the foundation thinking about who's doing a pilot phase is a project new, but what I would add to what Rose was saying is the idea of a pilot essentially is just really about the evidence and testing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a formal pilot for you to gather evidence to show to a funder that your ideas are well based in the need. So one of the things that is possible to do on a very low budget, because we're all so used to, hosting things online, etc., is to use opportunities, create opportunities to use a test. Instead of having to go through a full pilot of delivery, think about how your organisation can gather data in really small, in quite easy ways, and really build your case through those means. Having online sessions that might be a kind of 2.0 version of what you're going to do. That would be like if something far more fancy if you had the funds to do it, but also really relying on your audiences and what you say about being embedded in communities. It's about really reaching out and listening and being able to evidence the things that you wish to do. And that goes back to the theory of change, really, because if your organisation has an overall aim, then you can start to look at all of the different areas by which you can have very small, levels of interaction, but that can have a huge impact. So it's about maybe pulling together things that you're already doing as an organisation in different ways. So for example, if you've got individuals in your organisation who are looking at what partners are doing, or you're part of a partnership that might not be the exact same delivery that you want to then bid for, but what have you learned from different elements of your organisational operational activity that can be pulled together into a sort of pilot, where you can evidence that you've tested different elements of something larger, although you might not have run a pilot of the same thing.
Pavisha, I think that's brilliant advice. It's going to help a lot of people, because I think a lot of people are always thinking, gosh, I have to do the first year essentially myself. But actually what you're saying is think about the principles of what you're trying to achieve and how you might be able to prove those ideas. I think that's super. Thank you. And Katja, from your side, it's so interesting because Rhombert is absolutely grounded in the community. It's based on the South Bank. I know that your rent is your community program to the communities of the South Bank for your buildings. Yes. You're in, absolutely. And obviously now you're thinking about different locations and partnerships as well. How is this all affecting your thinking?
It's interesting, isn't it? It's been, I think, new leadership at Rhombert in the past sort of 5 years has meant, I suppose, looking at the strategy, of course, very much a focus on Arts Council investment principles at the moment as well. And it's been a brilliant journey, actually. I mean, I've been at Rhombert for sort of 3 years, and it has been exciting to sort of see the changes. And there is a huge program with the community, but we've only just begun in sort of from last September, our first citizen-led program with young people aged 16 to 19. And this is truly a test bed, I suppose, but it's something that is really critical and something that we want to obviously grow so that those young people are producing projects that go back into the South London community. They bring their friends, and this idea, I think that that you were saying around, unless the project has a pilot phase, it was challenging to find funding. We tried with the local councils, and they said that they weren't we weren't far enough along in the process. So similarly, we very luckily have a long-standing relationship with a funder, with a an individual, a private fund who has supported. But it's what Bhavisha said around looking at ways of sort of developing from what you are doing anyway, I think is incredibly important. And this, not and what Rose was saying, not a huge sum of money in the grand scheme of things, but looking at those smaller foundations to really sort of kick things off, I think has been really important for us.
And I think that your point is great there. It really speaks to what Rose was saying about, and if you have that breadth of funding base, so you had an individual who's committed to what you do, perhaps able to be a bit more flexible, that's so helpful, isn't it? Absolutely. Right, I've got one more question, and perhaps I can stay with you, Katja, just if I may, which is thinking about board members. How would you particularly recommend involving them in trust fundraising, especially if they perhaps don't have a network, which is individuals who are trustees? What role can they play in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I would always, of course, involve board members, because they can be so, the knowledge that they might have without even knowing that they have the knowledge. You have to sort of engage with them all. I mean, what I would always do on a fairly regular basis is send or discuss with board members our prospects, and if they did know any trustees within those trusts and foundations, that's hugely helpful. As you say, they may not, but they may have some intelligence about the trust or about those trustees on the board. I have certainly asked members of our board to read applications or proposals. Just having somebody who isn't in that nitty-gritty detail, they're in the family, but they're not in that detail, and maybe even some of the words that we might use that on a regular basis, that they might say, I really don't understand what that sentence means. Just having somebody else on the level of one of the trustees that will be reading your application. I remember meeting with the grants manager from John Ellerman fairly recently, and she just said, look, our trustees see applications about the arts, medical, environment. They're not experts, they're not experts on all of them. You need to be, you need to sort of frame it in a way that anyone will understand. So I think that's really helpful from trustees. And then I suppose, introducing board members, if you do get trust and foundation contacts to come to events, it's always incredibly helpful to have board members speak to them and sort of host them. And in terms of advocacy, something that ROMBED does is often invite our board to things like staff training that we do. So it really helps them, I think, keep up on trends in, say, EDI or environmental sustainability that they may not have in their own workplace. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, that's great advice. Bhavisha, very quickly, because I know we'll want to do questions from the floor. Is there anything you want to add from a funder's perspective of what you might be looking at from the trustees? What are you looking for there?
I think it all depends on the size of the organisation. I mean, certainly we would expect, if we were going to do a due diligence process, to see that policies, etc., had been signed off very recently from trustees and that they're refreshed regularly. So some of that administration and housekeeping is really important, because it's something that we would look at. But one of the things that we fully understand, with especially very small organisations, their board members, directors have a real close affinity with the work of the organisation, and they are often contributing quite heavily to that. And therefore, it's fine to invite board members along to discussions with funders. We would love to see different people from your organisation join a webinar. We're hosting one at Freelance Foundation for Space to Dream Fund. We specifically asked that 2 members from an organisation joined the training that we were hosting, because we want to ensure that across an organisation that knowledge is filtering through, experience is filtering through, and we feel that it's easier then for somebody on the board or a director to work closely with the person who's applying for the fund because they're on the same level of knowledge?
No, I think that resonates with us very strongly. As you know, we recently launched a sort of top paper as a little infographic for board papers, because we're conscious that sometimes board and staff are seeing things through a different lens, and it's really critical they have that shared approach. Rose, any final words of wisdom from you on this point before we go quickly to questions from the floor?
Nothing hugely to add other than just, I think everyone loves to be asked their advice, don't they? And I think, can you get trustees who are perhaps members of a particular subcommittee or responsible even for a certain brief, whether it's finance or EDI, not that any one person should ever be responsible for either of those things, but can you get them involved in drafting or reviewing particular questions perhaps? And just to echo that point about relationship building and cultivation, I think there's really no reason why a well-briefed trustee shouldn't come along to a funder meeting or a Zoom with you.
Super, thanks Rose. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and a huge thank you to our fantastic panel. What a great discussion. I mean, so many key takeaways and insights that I know people watching at the moment are going to find this incredibly helpful. We are really interested to hear from attendees who are watching as to what tools you might find helpful to support you in navigating grant giving in the current landscape. So do add those into the chat. In the meantime, yes, we have had some questions, Caroline. I'm going to kick us off with a really interesting one about referencing priority places. So the question is, it's an organisation located in London that can't move, and there's such competition for funds in the area, as we know and as we've touched on. Does the panel have any thoughts for organisations that are not in priority places? Rose, do you mind if I come to you first on that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I would just always go back to kind of listening and information gathering and partnerships as well as being perhaps a kind of triumvirate of really important things that you could be doing. I think, always remember that, you as the organisation are not the beneficiary really, although that might sound odd, and the funder is looking to invest in change. You're their agent for delivering that really brilliantly. But the people that you are working with or that you want to work with should kind of really shine through to make your applications and your strategy really sing. So yeah, I would just counsel kind of putting that time in to develop partnerships. And I thought that was a really good point from Bavisha as well about, that doesn't always have to be onerous. It can be Zooms and more informal networks and emails even, and just getting to know the people in the places that you do want to work.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rose. And I'm going to just put one more question to the panel because I'm conscious of time. It's fascinating this. So there's so much that obviously goes into trust fundraising beyond making the most compelling case for a project or for a piece of work. The question here is, how can a fundraiser skill up so that they have a deeper understanding of that holistic view that so many funders are now taking of applicants? Bavisha, I wonder if I could come to you on that one, get your thoughts.
Attending webinars like this for a start. But I would also look at the amount of information that funders publish, and even if they're not a funder that is particularly working with your art form or your sector, there are so much thoughts out there. So I would quite often look at National Heritage Lottery Fund, because when you look at all of the publications that they have, which is around due diligence, what to do about the legal checks, you can really begin to learn, even if you haven't applied to that organisation for funding, what's going on behind the scenes at foundations. Also, having really wide awareness outside of the art sector, for example, picking up on trends through online magazines like Civil Society. Those are really quick, free ways for you to have a bit of a sense of what's going on, and you can upskill in a different way rather than the traditional I need to go on a trust and foundations training course. And also use the resources within your organisation. I say one of the key things is be best friends with your finance person, because genuinely, even from the grant making perspective, we do ask for quite a bit of detail around your accounts. Get to know the ins and outs of your accounts, and what is your reserves policy, understanding and knowing things like that, such as organisational risk, all of those elements that take to run an organisation and to run a successful project. It goes beyond the creative element, so it goes beyond your education team, and those are the things that I would advise fundraisers start to kind of be more familiar with.
Great, thank you, Bhavisha. Katya, is there anything else that you would add to that?
No, I think Bhavisha's kind of summed up brilliantly. I suppose the only other thing I'd add is, you use those trust and foundation tools, sign up to their newsletters, you'll get to know about reports that they're putting out. And organisations like the Association of Charitable Foundation does do really great reports on trends, Arts Council. So the knowledge is out there, but you might have to do a little bit of searching for it.
Lovely. Thank you, Katya. So I think we're probably ready to wind up today's conversation. So I would just first off like to say a huge thank you to Bhavisha, to Katya and to Rose, and of course to Caroline for chairing what's been a really invigorating and fascinating discussion today. As you know, here at Achates, we offer a range of services, including recruitment, fundraising, strategy, and organisational development. So if you are interested in discussing how we may be able to support you, or if you just like to speak to a member of our team, then please do just drop us a line. We're at info@achates.org.uk. And last of all, just to note that our next Achates live event will be on Thursday, the 9th of June, and there'll be more details to follow soon. So do keep an eye on your inbox. I just would like to say thank you so much again to our panel. Goodbye, Bhavisha. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kat. Lovely to have you with us.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to Rose, of course.
Thank you. It's been brilliant.
And thank you very much to Caroline for running today's session for us.
My pleasure, Deborah. Always good to welcome a brilliant panel like this today. Thanks to you.
And thank you for joining us this afternoon and watching the session. Hope it's been as useful, certainly as I've found it. And we look forward to